At 0412 hours local time, the first behemoth drone punched through the smoke hanging over the southern apron of Engels 2 airbase and dove straight into the fuselage of a Tu-95 MS strategic bomber parked beside the weapons loading crane. The 300-kilogram warhead detonated against the aircraft's midsection, directly above the internal weapons bay where 4 Kh-101 cruise missiles had already been mounted onto their rotary launchers. The blast pressure tore the bomber apart from the inside. The fuselage split along its spine. Both wings folded upward and collapsed. Aviation kerosene from the half-filled fuel tanks ignited on contact with the open air, creating a fireball that climbed 150 feet above the tarmac and threw burning wreckage across the loading pad. 40 meters away, the second Tu-95 MS in the row caught fire from the blast wave alone. Fuel began leaking from a ruptured wing root, feeding a river of flame that spread along the concrete toward the third bomber in line. But this was not just another drone strike on a Russian airfield. Engels 2 was the beating heart of Russia's strategic air force. This was where the Tu-95 MS Bear bombers lived, the 4-engine turboprop giants that carried Kh-101 cruise missiles across Ukrainian airspace and dropped them onto apartment buildings in Kyiv, hospitals in Odessa, and schools in Kharkiv. Every mass missile strike that had torn through Ukrainian cities for the past 4 years had begun here, on this tarmac, with these aircraft. And tonight, 11 of them had been pulled out of their hardened shelters and lined up on the open apron beside the loading cranes, their weapons bays open, their missile rails waiting, and their fuel tanks being filled for a mass strike that was supposed to launch before dawn. Ukraine had just caught them on the ground, and the woman who made it possible was not a pilot or a commander. She was a satellite imagery analyst who had noticed something that every other person in the intelligence chain had missed. Her name was Daryna. She was 28 years old. She worked inside the targeting intelligence cell of the GUR, Ukraine's main directorate of intelligence, in a secure basement room at an undisclosed location in central Ukraine. Her job was to spend 14-hour shifts comparing satellite passes over Russian military airfields, measuring shadows cast by aircraft to determine their type and position, counting every bomber on every tarmac that Ukrainian satellites could photograph from orbit. She logged parking positions. She tracked shelter occupancy. She noted fuel truck movements and weapons loading schedules. Most days, the data was routine. The patterns were so consistent she could tell time by them. But 5 days before the strike, the pattern at Engels broke. Daryna was reviewing the latest satellite pass captured at 0300 hours Moscow time when she stopped scrolling. On the southern apron, beside the weapons loading area, 11 Tu-95 MS bombers were parked in 2 rows. Not dispersed across the airfield in individual shelters the way Russia had been doing for the past 8 months. Clustered together, in the open, beside the loading cranes. She pulled the previous pass from 12 hours earlier. The southern apron was empty. The bombers were in their shelters. She pulled a week of passes. Shelters, every single time. Something had changed in the last 12 hours. She opened the intercepted communications database and found it within 20 minutes. A logistics manifest intercepted 48 hours earlier referenced a bulk delivery of Kh-101 cruise missiles to Engels 2, enough to arm 11 aircraft simultaneously. She cross-referenced with the maintenance patterns she had been tracking for months. Russia loads Kh-101 missiles onto Tu-95 MS bombers using mobile hydraulic crane systems on the southern apron. Each aircraft takes 6 to 8 hours to fully load. The cranes can service 2 aircraft simultaneously. For 11 bombers, the entire loading process takes 18 to 24 hours. During that window, the bombers cannot be in their shelters. They must be on the open apron, stationary, and surrounded by missile transport vehicles, fuel trucks, and ground crew. Daryna calculated the timeline. If loading began at 0100 hours, the process would continue for at least 18 more hours. After that, the bombers would take off and launch up to 88 Kh-101 cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities, each one carrying a 400-kilogram warhead, each one capable of flying at treetop altitude for 1,500 kilometers before slamming into a residential building or a power station. She had 18 hours to stop it. Daryna immediately requested an emergency briefing with her section chief, Colonel Mykola Savchenko. She laid the satellite passes, the intercepted manifest, and the loading timeline on his desk. Savchenko looked at the images, counted the bombers, and shook his head. "Shulha, We have hit Engels 4 times in the past year. Every time, we damage fuel trucks and crater a taxiway, and Russia repairs it within 3 weeks. The bombers always survive because they move before our drones arrive. We lost 26 drones on the last mission and destroyed 1 fuel storage building. What makes you believe this time will be different? Daryna pointed to the loading timeline. Sir, the bombers cannot move. They are physically locked beside the cranes. If we strike during the loading window, they have nowhere to go. This is the first time in 8 months that more than 3 bombers have been outside their shelters at the same time. Savchenko studied the image again. The probability of getting enough drones through is too low. I am not recommending this to command. Daryna walked out without arguing. She went back to her workstation and opened a new file. She had 16 hours left. She was not going to waste them waiting for permission. For the next 36 hours, Daryna constructed the most detailed strike dossier the targeting cell had ever produced. She mapped every air defense system along the Volga corridor, 2 S-400 batteries, 3 Pantsir S-1 positions, a Buk M3 battalion, Pol 21 GPS jamming, and Krasuka 4 broadband suppression blanketing the airfield perimeter. Then she found the gap. She had been tracking Russian air defense movements around Engels for months. She noticed that before every mass bomber launch, Russia moved one of its 2 S-400 batteries 60 kilometers south along the bomber flight path toward Ukraine, providing escort coverage during transit. During the loading window, the northern approach was covered by only 1 S-400 battery instead of 2. The coverage arc from the north dropped by nearly 40%. A corridor that was normally sealed by overlapping engagement zones now had a gap 7 kilometers wide along the Volga floodplain. She also discovered that the weapons loading area sat directly beside the airfield's main fuel depot. 8 above-ground storage tanks holding tens of thousands of liters of aviation kerosene, less than 80 meters from the nearest bomber. And beside the cranes, rows of Kh-101 missiles in transport canisters were staged on the tarmac. Each canister contained a 400-kilogram warhead and a tank of jet fuel. If fire reached the staged missiles, the secondary explosions could destroy everything within 200 meters. Daryna printed the dossier, 43 pages. She placed it on Savchenko's desk. He read it in silence. When he reached the air defense gap analysis, he stopped. Then he picked up a secure telephone. "Get me General Melnik. Tell him we have a window at Engels. And tell him it closes in 18 hours. The attack package was designated HRIM, 78 long-range attack drones. 30 Behemoth heavy strike drones, Ukraine's newest long-range platform, a jet-powered one-way attack drone with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers and autonomous inertial optical AI navigation, each carrying a 300-kilogram penetration warhead. Supporting them were 48 Sechin-type saturation drones for radar bait and air defense exhaustion. The launch site was concealed in western Ukraine. The flight path ran east through Kharkiv Oblast, crossed into Russia over Voronezh, then turned south along the Volga through the gap Daryna had identified. Total flight distance, 930 kilometers. The 18-hour window was now down to 11. Every minute of delay meant another bomber could finish loading and taxi away. At 18:30 hours, 78 drones left their launchers. The behemoths banked east. The Sichins followed in staggered waves. At 21:07 hours, the formation crossed into Russian airspace over Voronezh. No reaction for the first 40 minutes. The crossing point exploited a known gap between surveillance zones, and the formation held 200 meters altitude. At 21:52 hours, the Nebo-M radar southeast of Voronezh detected the formation. The contact was flagged and transmitted to the regional command center. The handoff to the S-400 at Engels took 8 minutes. At 2200 hours, the fire control radar locked onto the swarm. The battery had 32 missiles against 78 targets. The commander ordered the first salvo. 4 missiles launched, 2 Sichin kills. 1 missile lost its target behind terrain. 1 detonated in the gap between 2 closely spaced drones without destroying either. A second salvo launched immediately, but the formation had already scattered. 12 Sichins climbed and amplified their signatures as deliberate decoys. The second salvo chased them. 3 Sichins destroyed. 8 missiles total, 5 kills. Behind the decoy screen, 30 behemoths continued south at 200 meters, untouched. The battery commander retargeted on the lower group. The behemoths had dropped to 100 meters along the Volga floodplain. 4 more missiles launched. One found a behemoth that drifted above the formation ceiling. The other 3 lost their targets in ground clutter. 12 missiles spent, 6 total kills, 20 missiles remaining, 67 drones still flying. At 22:31 hours, the Buck M3 battalion engaged, 6 missiles in 2 salvos. The first salvo destroyed 2 Sichens and missed a behemoth that dove to 60 meters. The second salvo killed 1 behemoth cleanly, lost 1 missile in river reflections, and 1 overshot a target that crossed behind trees at the critical moment. 6 Buck missiles spent, 3 kills, 61 drones continued south. At 22:44 hours, Pole 21 activated. GPS denial swept the formation. 3 Sichens with simpler navigation drifted off course and eventually crashed. But the behemoths switched to inertial optical mode within 2 seconds, locking onto the Volga River below and following its western bank using bridges, towns, and railway crossings as waypoints. Krasuka 4 broadband jamming activated shortly after, killing video feeds, but the behemoths no longer needed the video link for navigation. Their AI was flying the route autonomously. 55 drones continued. The loading window was down to less than 5 hours. At 23:02 hours, the 2 Pantsir S1 systems on the airfield perimeter detected the swarm at 16 kilometers. The northern Pantsir fired first. 2 missiles, 1 behemoth destroyed at 9 kilometers. 1 Sichen shattered in midair. 2 more missiles launched. 1 hit. 1 lost its lock behind a perimeter building. The southern Pantsir fired simultaneously. 2 missiles. 1 hit. 1 missed when the target banked sharply and dropped to 60 meters. 6 Pantsir missiles spent. 4 kills. The formation split into 5 terminal attack groups approaching from different angles. Both Pantsir systems switched to cannon fire. 5,000 rounds per minute per system poured into the night sky. 8 Sichen drones climbed and flew directly at the northern Pantsir as sacrificial targets. 5 were shredded by cannon rounds. 2 exploded close enough to crack the radar housing. 1 Sichen made it through and dove into the Pantsir's hull. The explosion destroyed the radar compartment and silenced the cannons. The northern Pantsir was out of the fight. The southern Pantsir was now the only close-range defense for the entire airfield. Its crew swung the turret between approach axes, destroying 3 more drones with cannon fire, but unable to cover every angle. On the ground, security troops opened fire with AK-12 rifles and vehicle-mounted cord machine guns. At 160 kilometers per hour, the drones crossed the remaining distance in seconds. 22 behemoths reached the southern apron. At 23:21 hours, the first wave of 8 behemoths dove into the bomber line. The lead drone struck the first 295 ms above the weapons bay. The aircraft tore apart. Wings collapsed. Burning kerosene sprayed across the loading pad. The second behemoth hit the next bomber's cockpit section. The third and fourth struck 2 more aircraft, igniting wing tank fuel. Within 30 seconds, 4 bombers were burning. The 5th, 6th, and 7th behemoths struck 3 more in the second row. 1 hit the starboard wing root, blowing the wing off entirely. Another severed the tail section. The third detonated 2 Kh-101 missiles still in transport canisters beside the aircraft, triggering a massive secondary explosion that rolled across the apron. The 8th behemoth was clipped by machine gun fire, lost its attack angle, and slammed into the tarmac 15 meters short of its target. The blast wave started a fire in the bomber's wheel well that would eventually spread to the wing tanks. 7 bombers destroyed or burning. 4 remained on the apron. At 23:23 hours, the second wave of 7 behemoths dove into the fuel depot. The first drone struck tank number 2. Kerosene vapor ignited, then the liquid fuel caught. A column of fire erupted 60 meters into the sky. The second drone hit tank number 4. The third hit tank number 6. 3 tanks burning violently. The heat reached tank number 3 between them. Its roof seam failed and it erupted into full-surface fire. The remaining behemoths struck tanks 5, 7, and 8, and the main fuel pumping station. The pumping station exploded, severing the underground pipeline feeding the airfield fuel network. Fire spread along surface fuel lines toward the burning bombers. At 23:26 hours, the final wave of 7 behemoths dove into the Kh-101 missile stockpile, staged on the apron beside the loading cranes. The first behemoth struck a row of 6 transport canisters. 1 warhead cooked off, then another, then a third, the explosions walking down the row. The second and third drones destroyed the mobile loading cranes. The fourth struck a missile transport truck still loaded with 2 canisters. The fifth and sixth targeted the weapons storage access road, destroying transport vehicles and blocking it with burning wreckage. The seventh cratered the apron surface between the surviving bombers and the fuel depot, making the tarmac impassable for tow vehicles. By 23:34 hours, the southern apron of Engels 2 was an inferno. 7 Tu-95 MS bombers were destroyed. 3 more had caught fire from the spreading fuel depot blaze. 1 bomber at the far end had been under tow when the attack began and survived with shrapnel damage. The fuel depot was fully engulfed, all 8 tanks burning. The KH-101 stockpile was destroyed, secondary explosions continuing for 3 hours. The mobile loading cranes were wrecked. The weapons access road was blocked. The fire would burn for 22 hours. The bomber airframes melted onto the tarmac. By morning, the southern apron was an unrecognizable landscape of blackened metal, cratered concrete, and twisted wreckage. But the northern shelters survived. 3 Tu-160 bombers on the opposite side of the airfield were untouched. Russia's strategic bomber capability was not eliminated, but the mass strike in preparation, 11 bombers with up to 88 KH-101 cruise missiles aimed at Ukrainian cities, was cancelled. The missiles were destroyed on the ground. The bombers were destroyed on the ground. The loading infrastructure would take months to rebuild. For the next several months, Russia's ability to launch mass cruise missile strikes from Engels would be severely degraded. The individual sorties could still fly from other airfields, but the coordinated mass launches that had terrorized Ukrainian cities, waves of 60 or 80 cruise missiles arriving simultaneously, could not be replicated without the loading infrastructure and aircraft concentration that had just been destroyed. The strike did not destroy every bomber in Russia's arsenal. It destroyed the ones that were being loaded with 88 cruise missiles aimed at Kyiv. And for every Ukrainian family that slept safely that night, the woman who found the window never needed to hear her name spoken out loud. In the secure room in central Ukraine, Daryna Shulha's satellite imagery folder was still open on her screen. The timestamp of the pass that revealed 11 bombers on the open apron was still highlighted in yellow. Her name did not appear in the victory report or the intelligence summary distributed to Allied partners. But the 43-page dossier that turned a routine satellite review into the most devastating strike on Russia's strategic air force since the war began sat in the classified archive, stamped with 2 words she had earned: window confirmed.